Did you know that burnout is one of the three main reasons why podcasters stop creating shows or go on what's called a temporary hiatus that essentially becomes a permanent one? And it's normally rooted on four main things. One is you have no goal for your podcast, you have no mission, so you kind of like run out of things to say. Or number two, you get overwhelmed with all the things that go into podcasting. Number three, your unreliable guests just throw a wrench into your content planner and publishing schedule. Number four, you're just tired of producing content, which is fair. But what if I told you that podcast replays are actually the solution for all of this and could even bring you more business than you thought while you're actually chilling? I know this episode is going to be covering the strategic ways to use a podcast replay, and I'm bringing you this episode from not my office. I know that it looks like it because I am using a green screen right now, but I am actually recording this from a hotel room in Bentonville, in Arkansas, because I needed to be away, and I was like, you know what? Let's do things differently this week. So if it looks different, sounds different, but that's not the reason why I am not bringing you rock and roll content this week. I'm Anna Xavier, and this is the podcast space, a podcast that is ethical, practical, but also imperfect because it just shows you that it's possible to create content and still create amazing connection with your listeners and grow your business. All right, let's go. First things first, what are podcast replays? These are just reruns of old episodes, and here's how you can use them. You can use them as full episodes, or you can splice specific sections of the episode and use them either in a new episode or a combination of like the best of, right? So you don't have to do them just individually. There's three ways, as I just mentioned, to use them. And so if you've been battling burnout, honestly, listen to this episode because I'm going to be covering who this is best for, do's and don'ts, misconceptions of the industry, and how you can use them to grow your business, how these actually can be a very strategic use of your content. So let's get into the first misconception. The first misconception is that it's for lazy people and it's sloppy. That's absolutely not the case. So if you stay until the end, I'm going to be covering exactly how you can use podcast replays in order to maximize your content and actually maybe even get some sales out of it. So stick until the end. And then another misconception is that there's no point repurposing content again because your listeners listened to it before. So what's the point? The point is actually, if you are listening to episode 5, I want you to go back and listen to episode 5, where I'm covering the types of listeners and types of audiences. And so in that episode, I am covering the two types of listeners, and that is a listener who is a super fan and a listener who's an occasional listener. And an occasional listener goes and selects the episodes they want to listen to either by title or, let's for instance say, the guest of the episode. Maybe they didn't listen to your episode then. It's a good opportunity to listen to them later on. I'm not going to get into the do's and don'ts just yet, but I just want to make sure that you understand that your listeners potentially, because you won't have in terms of percentages, maybe you will have like a 40%, 30% of super fans. Or if you are a podcaster who's really niche, maybe that number bumps all the way to 70%. But there's a high number of podcast listeners who will not listen to every single episode. So it's super important to be aware of that information. Another misconception is that they remember everything about your episode. So of course, you can't play that. Well, remember, the last time you listened to an episode, if you had to just tell me verbatim what was said, you couldn't remember, right? So there's benefits, especially if podcasts that are episodes that are super long. A replay will benefit you in just refreshing that information in your memory, in your listener's memory, I mean. And so the last one is that it will be repetitive. A replay is not repetitive if you do the do's that I'm going to be covering in this section in a bit. And so the last one is that it will look bad because it looks like you don't know enough, because if you're doing replays, do you really run out of things to say? Couldn't be further from the truth. So going back into the who this is right for. So this is right for you if you are a podcaster who gets easily overwhelmed. You have the best intentions, but there's just so much. Maybe an episode you wanted to release was super complex and you're just like, oh my gosh, it's like 7 p.m. the night before and you have to go out for some reason and the episode needs to be out at 8 a.m. the following day. Yep. This is perfect for you. Again, not saying this is the perfect solution every time. It's the occasional solution. And then this is for you is if you're a business owner who have your cycles of feast and famine. This is super important. And here's why. I work with a client that their December was insane. So they literally could not do anything from October to December. And then January was kind of like a slow month, but it was a good month for outreach. And so we made sure that we played replays when they couldn't record any episodes. And so when it was like at the end of the year, they were like, okay, we're done with, all the busy thing, but we still have showed up to our clients every single week until January, right? So it's important to remember that just because you're busy, just because you can't fit anyone else, it doesn't mean that you can't fit a wait list in the meantime, right? Because clients can be interested in your work while you're getting all of this done. And so remember that full books today does not necessarily mean full books in next month. And then replays are good for you if you are someone who has a lot of instability on their life. So for instance, if you have either a chronic illness that is very uncertain, or if you have family circumstances that you have to tend to frequently with very minimal heads up. There you go. And so that actually happened to two clients of mine. They had family emergencies. And we've been using replays to patch situations where maybe they had to leave out of town for longer than they expected, or maybe their mental health wasn't the best. So again, you're showing up to your listeners with minimal work. But I'm going to be talking about how do you select podcast replays in a way that is actually very strategic. So it's not just sliding them in just like that, right? Another reason why it may be good for you, a podcast replay strategy, is if you're an overcommitter and suddenly you've done you decided to create a very complex podcast episode that week, but then you realize that you actually are missing a few things. So you can use a replay this week and then finish, whatever you overcommitted to. And release that in the following week. But if you want it to be top of mind, but you're a creator who cannot keep consistent, it's important to know that, right? You can use replays to be top of mind. And then I want you to let me know. And honestly, my DMs are always open for you. However, no judgment zone, right? No judgment zone, because we can always improve. But if this is you and you're like, oh my God, this is me, and I realize that I've been overusing replays, and maybe that's the reason why my podcast isn't growing. Let's talk. Because honestly, it's easier than you think to just reassess. Normally, you're just either doing too many things that can be scaled back. And that's the number one reason clients that work with me say, you actually make it so practical that now I understand that I was doing 500 things and I don't need either there's no traction on the 500 things, or actually half of that can be repurposed in a different way, and I'm not creating constantly content that goes nowhere, right? So it's important to know that there's a way. So DM me. I'm at The Podcast Space on Instagram, and the website is thepodcastspace.com, obviously, as you know, because this is the name of this podcast. But I want you to reach out if you've been feeling super overwhelmed and you're using willy-nilly the replay strategy. So all right, let's get into the do's and don'ts. And this podcast episode has been a little bit interesting because I'm testing two things at the same time, which is one is recording standing. I'm holding microphone. God knows how the audio will be. I'm recording with my phone instead of my camera because the light isn't great, and I'm just doing this in a different setting. So even as I am recording this, my mindset is different because I'm just not in my current space. So anyway, no excuses here. Still creating content for you. So do's and don'ts. Don'ts. Do not use them as part of a strategy for a podcast that actually is serialized, that has to be listened in order. So if you're using for instance podcasts like Serial or something that is more scripted, if there's a logic to the path, do not break the logic by throwing a replay because you can't do something like that. If you can't release an episode that week, just don't release, right? Don't release a replay because it's going to be a mess. So that's the one time where I would say it's okay to skip a week. So do not use a replay as a strategy. If you're literally once a month, twice a month, if your podcast is weekly and you're constantly reusing old content, at some point for the listener, it's going to be like, why is there no content? And so when we get to the do's, we're going to go into like how you can use that in a way that makes sense. And then a bad way to use the replays is to ignore the shelf life of the content. And so that means that's why I always say create content that is evergreen, content that will not expire in 2 months, right? And so also be aware that if you're using a podcast that is talking about, Christmas and you're playing that in like June, it makes no sense, right? If there's like references to it, ideally you want to remove them ahead of time, but if you can't, that's when you release like an intro to the episode to kind of like give a little bit of context. I'm getting ahead of myself and talking about the do's, but so make sure that you're not reusing a replay that is specific to a time, or like for instance, talking about COVID, this happened a lot. We were using a lot of podcast episodes, and so I would go in post-production and remove the whole COVID-19 section where it just made it very obvious that it was about COVID-19, and it wasn't really purposeful. There was no purpose in today's time to talk about that specific section. So make sure that you're aware of that. And then do not replay an episode that was originally released less than 20 episodes ago. Why? Because it's too soon. Like normally you should wait a minimum of 3 to 6 months before releasing an episode again, just because it just makes it like it's too tight. If you scroll through your catalog, it just shows up twice. It kind of looks a little like lazy. So be aware of that. Another one is content that was bad. Replays of content that sounds or look or is visually bad. Like for instance, this episode, I know the content is good, so I'll maybe replay this episode later in the year. But something that I won't do is replay an episode that either the content was bad and the audio and video were bad, or both, right? And here's why. I will tell you about like the one specific reason, which is what you should be afraid of. There was this podcaster that I love her content, but for some reason, I don't know why, her content started getting really sloppy, and I realized that this content was like episodes that she had done years and years ago, and I do not know for whatever reason that her editor decided to repurpose them because the content wasn't good. The interview style, obviously she had grown as a host, so it was just everything was bad, and after I think it was like 4 weeks of replays that were just bad, I just stopped following her podcast altogether. And by the way, this was not a person that is like a small business owner trying to run their business. This is the person who is an actual millionaire, right? Where like obviously they have the money to hire someone who is qualified. So worst case scenario, someone stops listening to your content because you start being sloppy, or you decided to not listen to an episode and be like, it'll be fine. So be aware of that. Don't reuse content that doesn't fit your current strategy. I see this a lot of time when maybe someone shifted their whole business strategy or their business model, and suddenly they replay an episode of, like the early days of their business, and it does not make sense in their current communication. So be aware of like what stage of your business were you when you first released that episode, and where are you now? Does that still align, right? And then last but not least, I left the most controversial to the end, and that is using a replay where the guest was popular. And maybe it doesn't align with the business that you're doing right now. It wasn't the greatest of interviews, but maybe that person, especially with like TikTok and now like social media, because someone can become famous, very quickly, or just out of the blue, and you're trying to capitalize on that fame, right? So don't do it for the numbers. Like long term, it won't work, especially if like, and again, if it was a good episode, if it aligns, it makes sense, absolutely do it. But if you're solely the purpose of capitalizing on their like SEO, I'm sure there'll be some strategy, some podcast content strategists that will tell you like, yeah, use it. And I disagree. So now into the do's, how you should use podcast replays in a strategic way. So give replays breathing room from the original episode. As I was talking about, give at least 3 to 6 months kind of like breathing room between the original publishing date and now. And then check if your guest is still in business. This is like being a little bit over the top. I don't always do this, but sometimes people who are like very kind of like, they told you when they were interviewing with you, they're like, maybe we're going to pivot the business. Maybe we're going to close the business. Kind of like check that. Like, is this person in business? And here's why it's important. If they don't do that anymore, or if they don't do that side of the business, they're not going to be sharing the interview. So you're going to be doing all of this, and you're not going to be capitalizing on them sharing the episode or engaging with it, right? Because they don't want visibility on something they're not doing anymore. So be aware of that. And then another one is give the opportunity of content that maybe didn't perform that well to perform properly this time. And what I mean by this is that if you released a really good episode over Christmas, I can assure you that it got barely any listens, because that's normally traditionally a lower time for podcast downloads, because people are busy, people are like out and about, maybe they're with family. They may skip that episode and not listen to it, and then they forget. So give yourself opportunity to maybe re-release content that you were like, this is really good. Or maybe you know that you release an episode and it's that time of the year again where your listeners or your customers are going to need that type of content. Just give that an opportunity to perform better. But also maybe if you didn't do a good job at promoting the podcast then that week for whatever reason, sometimes looking at numbers, and if something didn't perform well, it does not mean that it was a bad episode, right? There's so many factors. And then when you're doing a replay, make sure that you're looking at your content calendar to maximize the opportunity. And so look at your calendar as an opportunity to maximize publishing times. So look at dates that relate to the content that you're releasing. So let's say you interviewed a chef. If it's World Pastry Day or Chef Appreciation Day, things like this are naturally going to boost your content, because in terms of the search term, there will be a surge in that type of topic that people will be searching for. So be clever. Don't just go willy-nilly. Just think about like, is there a date in the like later in the year that I can repurpose this episode and it will make sense? Like bonus points if you're planning that ahead of time, and then you'll have like a surprise, be like, oh, I scheduled this episode already. Cool. I can take a break this week. So something to think about. And then look at your guest's high tide. If it was a good show, if it was a fantastic guest that you just love to highlight, or maybe it was an email that you received of your guest like, hey, I'm finally releasing a new book. Could you please, if you don't have the time to interview me, could you replay our previous interview where people will be able to listen to that episode and search for me, right? And so your listeners are going to think two things. One, you're a giver, right? They're like, oh my gosh, that's so cool that they decided to do something like that, to reshare an episode because their guest is, releasing something new. Or then they're going to look at you and think, wow, you really keep up with what's happening in the world. So either way, win-win. And then just finishing up with some best practices. If you can, always record an intro. And it can be, again, if you're deciding to do a series, I think it's important to give context to why you're playing this. So if you're releasing a best of, or if you're releasing content in a way that is, for instance, like highlighting, Black History Month, there's so many ways to do things. I think that's important to give the proper context to the content, but also it doesn't mean that you need to create an intro to every single episode. So we did that with our client Jillian, where she recorded a dedicated intro, and we did like a whole season of of podcast best of. And so we had the teaser, we had the intro to the episode, and then the actual episode. So there was some context of why they were listening to that again. And then finally, I want you to consider this. Are you just kind of trying to stay afloat and creating sloppy content, or are you trying to be strategic? Because I'll tell you that if you're trying to just get your head over water week after week after week, what's going to happen is that it's going to take you twice as long or 3 times as long to grow and to get to your podcast goals, because you are just not thinking strategically about your content. You're just putting content out there just to fill some holes. So if this is the episode where you look at yourself and like bit by bit, you're describing me, let's talk, because I want to help you create better content that it doesn't get you in the overwhelm world, and that really helps you see concrete growth on your podcast, in your business, that you start getting more listener engagement. All of these things can happen, but they won't happen if your strategy is sloppy. So you can reach out to me on Instagram. I'm at the podcast space, but also on thepodcastspace.com. It's the home of all the resources for this podcast, and thepodcastspace.com/podcast for everything that I mentioned on this podcast. Link to episode 5, link to more episodes where you can determine what's the goal of your podcast. All of these things, they'll be there. So if you felt inspired, please rate and review the podcast. Give us a little 5 stars, at least 5 stars, because I think this episode was really good. And so if you're listening to this, share it with me. I would love to hear your ahas, and I'll see you on the next episode. Bye.